There have been a lot of great booking decisions in wrestling history. Decisions like having Hulk Hogan win the WWF title from the Iron Sheik in 1984 or the creation of the NWO in 1996. But on the other side of the coin, there have also been plenty of bad decisions too. But what were some of the worst examples of bad booking in wrestling history? Well, that's exactly what we're going to be looking at right now, starting with the Invasion. Yes, perhaps no other moment in wrestling history represents a bigger botch than this one, as there was just so much wasted potential here. After all, this was WWF versus WCW, the interpromotional war fans have been waiting for years to see. All Vince McMahon had to do after he bought his competition in 2001 was sign the big names and let the two sides go to war over supremacy. Hell, this could have given him years of storylines to work with, but in the end, the whole thing fizzled out in record time as it was done before the year was over. So what happened here to cause the Invasion, one of the surest fire can't misses ever, to fail? Well, it seems like it might have been the boss's ego, as he seemingly didn't want to book his former competition as anything less than second rate, with this meaning that the battle presented to fans on screen would always come across as very one-sided. That was how we got things like the Brothers of Destruction absolutely mauling Chronic at September 23rd's Unforgiven pay-per-view, or Diamond Dallas Page being made to look like a jobber upon his debut. But even then, this wasn't the biggest problem with the Invasion. No, it was that none of the real stars of WCW were there, outside of DDP and Booker T. That's right, Hollywood Hogan, Kevin Nash, Scott Hall, Goldberg, Sting, Ric Flair, Scott Steiner, Lex Luger, even Eric Bischoff, none of them were present inside of a WWF ring in 2001. Why weren't they there? Well, because Vince McMahon had decided not to pay the extra money to buy them out of their Time Warner contracts, as he felt this would have cost too much and upset his own pay structure. And what a shame this was for fans, as not having these people there made the idea that WCW was invading feel false, as most of the wrestlers people associated with the promotion were absent. So it was that at that year's Survivor Series, the whole angle ended with a whimper instead of a bang, and WWF moved on from it as quickly as they possibly could. But that's not the only bad decision that would be made that year, because earlier in the spring, the Attitude Era would come to its official end when Steve Austin turned heel at WrestleMania 17. Yes, this one can be largely attributed for why the turn of the millennium boom period ended for wrestling. Sure, there are more factors than just one heel turn involved, factors such as the end of both WCW and ECW, and the failure of the Invasion angle. But if you were to go back and pin down one key moment where the good times came to an end, it would be the moment Stone Cold shook hands with Vince McMahon in the middle of the ring to close out the biggest show of the year. Come on now, who wanted to boo Steve Austin in 2001? After all, it was Austin who was responsible for most of those fans getting back into wrestling in 1998 when he took off as the biggest star the industry had seen since Hulk Hogan. And a big part of what made him so cool back then was he was the ultimate anti-hero. Someone who rebelled against everything that was put in front of him, with his biggest source of ire being saved for his megalomaniacal boss, Vince McMahon. Yes, throughout 1998 and the first half of 1999, seeing the Rattlesnake regularly humiliate his employer helped take WWF to all new heights of mainstream success and catapulted the wrestling industry into its second boom period. So in a sense, it's almost poetic that this boom period ended with Austin turning his back on all of that and instead choosing to side with Vince. Still though, that doesn't make it any less of a stupid decision, as there was no good reason to do it, other than if you actively wanted to turn off your fan base. Why did such a move happen? Well, it was Stone Cold himself that made the decision and wanted to change. And while it's true that he wasn't as white-hot as he had been a couple of years earlier, the answer surely wasn't to have him turn his back on everything he'd represented before. No, well, Austin could have pulled off a heel turn in 2001 if the circumstances had been right, having him specifically choose to align himself with the guy he'd been fighting for years prior. Well, that just didn't sit right with fans. And because of that, then, many of these fans tuned out, with this starting the end of the biggest boom period in wrestling history. And this isn't the only time a bad decision has been made with a wrestler called Austin, because years later in 2022, the exact same thing happened with Austin Theory and his ill-fated Money in the Bank cash-in. You all remember this one, don't you? The time Austin Theory won the Money in the Bank ladder match and earned himself a shot at the top prize at any time of his choosing? It really should have been an easy story to tell. After all, WWE had been telling it for over a decade by then. An up-and-coming heel wins the briefcase, waits till the opportune time to strike, then walks away with the gold in as sneaky a fashion as possible. Sure, there had been examples of people failing in their cash-in attempts before this, but at least they'd all gone after a world title. In the case of Theory, though, he made the truly baffling decision to instead challenge for the United States title. And what's more, when he did cash in, he'd lose. Needless to say then, this has since gone down as one of the most bizarre choices made by Triple H as a booker, as most of what he's given us has been great otherwise. Yes, we can't figure out what the logic was here, as all it did was make the Atlanta native look stupid. Sure, you could make the argument that he knew he had no chance of beating Roman Reigns, so his best bet was to just go after a mid-card belt instead, but then to have him fail to win that too just made little sense. And to make it all even worse, mere weeks later, Theory would actually win the US title from then champion Seth Rollins in a rematch, making us all question why he hadn't just won it the first time around. Yes, this truly has to rank as the worst Money in the Bank cash-in of all time. Would Austin ever recover from this? Not quite yet, because as it stands today, he's caught in mid-card tag team limbo with Grayson Waller, a far cry from the new face of the company position Vince McMahon had evidently seen him being in one day. And this isn't the only time Triple H has been involved in a story involving bad booking, as back in 2011, fans would also be confused when he pinned CM Punk right at the height of the Summer of Punk. That's right, back in 2011, CM Punk was about as white hot could be, with this being the point he'd just cut his blistering pipe bomb promo, and in the process, become the most talked about thing in the industry. So over did Phil Brooks get then, in fact, the company would change their SummerSlam plans and go with him versus John Cena for the moniker of Real World Champion after Punk had won the belt at Money in the Bank and then left with it. Yes, it's true that much of the magic of the second Summer of Punk had already been squandered by the time Triple H got involved, as the Second City Saint returning to a WWE ring way sooner than he should have after walking out killed much of the mystique of the angle. But it was still certainly more than salvageable. Unfortunately for all the fans watching though, things were about to get worse, because after being screwed out of the title at SummerSlam by The Game, Punk found himself veering away from the world title scene entirely. That's right, instead he would now get caught up in the death spiral that was a three-way program between him, Triple H, and Kevin Nash. And it wasn't as if Big Sexy even got his comeuppance here, because the voice of the voiceless would never actually step in the ring with him. Rather, the blow-off to the entire thing would be him and The Game in a one-on-one match, with The Game winning. And as if that wasn't bad enough, in the weeks following getting beaten by Triple H, Punk would be made to look like even more of a fool when the anti-authority rebel found himself teaming up with the enemy. Sure, he would eventually win the WWE title back in Survivor Series, and from there go on a great 434-day run with it, but by then, the Summer of Punk had ended, and the frustrations this created would greatly contribute towards the Chicago native's decision to quit the company altogether in 2014 and spend almost a decade away from the industry after that. Obviously then, for this reason alone, Triple H beating Punk has to rank as one of the worst booking decisions WWE made during the 2010s, as it halted any hope they had of getting that elusive third boom period. But it's not just WWE who has been responsible for bad booking decisions over the years. No, WCW made their fair share of them too. And one of the most notable of these would be our next entry, the time Rey Mysterio unmasked at Super Brawl 9. Yes, the amount of money WWE has made over the years merchandising Rey Mysterio masks should be reason enough to keep one of the greatest luchadors ever under one. And if that isn't reason enough, there's also the fact that he looks like a superhero who fans watching the show can get behind in droves. But Eric Bischoff felt that having Rey under a mask was stopping him from getting over during the late 90s, this despite the fact he was already massively over. And so Bischoff's decision then was to book him in a hair versus mask match at the aforementioned Super Brawl on February 21st, 1999, and there have him lose. What happened after that? Well, as per the pre-match stipulation, Rey would have to remove his mask. And while there were some upsides to having Rey unmask, any positives were massively outweighed by the negatives, because for all the reasons we mentioned before, Rey Mysterio, without his trademark face covering, just felt wrong on all fronts. Needless to say then, after this, the Lucha star would falter more and more in WCW, with it not really being until he joined WWE in 2002 that it felt like things were finally back on track for him. And a big reason things got back on track at this point was because, after speaking to the Lucha Council and getting specific permission from them, he was able to start wearing his mask again. But none of this would have been necessary if he hadn't been booked to remove it in the first place. No, if things had gone different, then maybe Rey would have been an even bigger star in Atlanta. And maybe then when he finally did go over to WWE, it would feel like an even bigger deal than it did at the time. But it was what it was, and nothing can change that now. No, all we can do is try to forget it ever happened and pretend like we don't know what Rey's face looks like. And it's not like WCW didn't make worse decisions than this over the course of their history, as earlier on in 1999, they'd made an even more painful one when they booked the infamous Fingerpoke of Doom. Yes, if there was ever one moment which signified the fact that WCW had truly jumped the shark, then this was it. Sure, the wheels had very much come off the tracks already by that point, and things were on a downswing they may never have been able to recover from, even if this hadn't happened. But so bad was this, it's since become emblematic of everything WCW were doing wrong. What did happen exactly? Well, after 1996, 1997, and 1998 had been dominated by the NWO story, it felt like the company might be ready to move on to something new, when in the latter year, Bill Goldberg beat Hollywood Hogan to become WCW champion. And while this was happening, the NWO itself was fracturing right down the middle as a civil battle erupted between the Hulkster's Hollywood faction and Kevin Nash's Wolfpack one. That's right, it looked as if the New World Order was at last coming to an end, and Goldberg was going to be the guy going forward. That was until Bill lost the title to Big Sexy at Starrcade on December 27, 1998, with this also marking the end of his 173-0 undefeated streak. But this wasn't the worst part of the whole thing. No, the worst part came on the January 4th, 1999 episode of Nitro a week later, as that was when Hulk Hogan, now a babyface once more, returned from a brief sabbatical to finally put down Kevin Nash once and for all, and rid WCW of the evil menace he'd helped to create in the first place. Sure, it might have sounded like a decent idea on the face of things. After all, it was still theoretically going to mean the end of the NWO. The only problem was, once the match hit the ring, Hogan immediately poked Nash with a single finger, causing Big Sexy to flop to the ground as he allowed himself to be pinned 1, 2, 3. Why had this happened? Well, the NWO had been in cahoots all along and were now back together as one single united force. Yes, the storyline with no end kept going as it became clear WCW had few other ideas. And this left many to tune out and never tune back in again. And on top of this, it was the same episode where commentator Tony Schiavone infamously told fans that Mick Foley was going to win the WWF title on a taped edition of Raw over on the other channel. So there was no reason for them to tune in to what Vince McMahon was doing. The only problem with this, though, was that fans wanted to see Mankind win the big one. A lot more than they wanted to see the NWO reform. So this created a double whammy of embarrassment for the company. But what about our next subject? Yet another example of poor booking from WCW in the late 90s, the time Bret Hart joined the promotion. That's right, following the events of the Montreal Screwjob at the November 9th, 1997 Survivor Series, Bret Hart was just about the biggest babyface in the entire industry. So for WCW to have signed him to a contract then, it should have been an absolutely can't-miss situation. But never underestimate late-period WCW's ability to botch things beautifully, and if you ever needed any evidence of them doing this, then you only need to look at what came next with the Hitman during his WCW run. Would WCW immediately capitalize on what they had with Bret by putting him in a big-time program with someone like Hollywood Hogan? Not quite. Would they at least push him as a serious world title contender right away? Unfortunately, no. Instead, he'd be made to look like a fool during his first appearance at Starrcade 1997 when, in a rehash of the Montreal Screwjob, he'd come out to stop Sting from getting screwed out of beating the Hulkster, this despite the fact that Hogan had just won clean. Still though, at least it wasn't the intention to make the excellence of execution look bad here, and now that it was over, they could fix things by booking him like the star he was, right? Well, not quite. Because for the next 2 years, the Calgary native would do little of note, only mill around in mainly mid-card programs, most of which gave him anything to sink his teeth into. So why did WCW botch this one so spectacularly? Well, if Eric Bischoff is to be believed, he couldn't do anything with Bret back then, as Bret had lost any passion he had for wrestling, with this becoming more intense after his brother Owen passed away in May of 1999. But even when the company finally did start running with Bret as a top guy and world champion in late 1999, it would still be snakebit. And the reason that spell of hope ended so badly was because it was at Starrcade on December 19th of this year that Bret took a mule kick to the head from Bill Goldberg during their match together, with this severely concussing him. And this all led to Bret developing post-concussion syndrome and being forced to retire. And like that, the career of Bret Hitman Hart ended in the limpest way possible. But WCW wasn't the only big North American wrestling company going out of business in 2001. No, as we mentioned earlier, that year would also see the collapse of ECW, and it could be argued a part of the reason they fell apart was because they never pulled the trigger and gave their world title to Rob Van Dam. To be fair though, it wasn't like Paul Heyman didn't have plans on putting the world title on RVD at certain points during his run. But circumstances like injury always seem to get in the way of this. Yes, during the midst of the Battle Creek Natives' legendary 700-day-long reign as television champion between 1998 and 2000, it was clear the company was building up to some kind of champion versus champion match where Rob would ultimately come out on top. But because ECW waited so long to pull the trigger on this, it never ended up happening because before it could, a broken leg would force RVD to vacate his secondary gold. Sure, you could argue this was somewhat out of Paul Heyman's control, but even if that is true, there's no excuse for not giving one of your most over stars a world title reign prior to this, as he was signed with the company as far back as 1996 and was just as over on day one as he would be when the promotion eventually closed its doors in 2001. Yes, really, this is a prime example of failing to strike while the iron was hot. Would Extreme Championship Wrestling have survived if RVD became world champion? Probably not, as the constant exodus of top talent was always going to bring about its end sooner or later, but it might have been a success for a little longer than it was had Mr. Monday Night truly been treated like the top guy at any point. And even though Van Dam ended up winning the ECW World title in WWE, it just wasn't the same as it would have been had he done it with the original version of the belt. No, the whole WWE-ECW brand just didn't hit the same way as the true ECW did. And around the same time as WWE-ECW was closing its doors, another bad booking decision was taking place when the Nexus got beat at SummerSlam 2010. Yes, back in 2010, after a fantastic debut which saw them wipe out the entire ringside area on an episode of Raw, the NXT Season 1 class of Wade Barrett, Skip Sheffield, David Otunga, Justin Gabriel, Heath Slater, Darren Young, Michael Tarver, and Daniel Bryan felt like the hottest heel act WWE had put out in years. In fact, so hot was the whole thing, it immediately drew comparisons to probably the most famous invasion angle of all time, the NWO. Seriously, back during a time when Vince McMahon's product wasn't at its best, this was exactly what they needed to give them a boost. Yes, this invading force could have felt like a legitimate threat if they had defeated some major babyfaces, but alas, that didn't happen. And this is because the Nexus would lose in their first big match, immediately putting a stop to their aura in the process. That's right, when it came time for the heels to take on a babyface alliance led by John Cena at SummerSlam in August of that year, rather than have them win and continue their warpath for several more months, the Nexus would instead look like a crew of lower card acts who quite simply couldn't get the job done by the time things were over. And what's worse, it could have been an easy task for them on this particular night too, as at one point they had a 3-1 advantage over Big Match John. With this being the Super Cena era though, he'd reign supreme, with Cena allegedly even pushing for this to happen himself. And so it was that with his backstage power combined with the boss's desire to see his top star never look weak, Wade Barrett and crew never stood a chance. And unfortunately, the Nexus would never fully recover from this, with the group pretty much becoming a mid-card heel act in short order. And when it came to the plans to push Wade Barrett as a top guy and maybe even challenge The Undertaker's streak the following year at WrestleMania 27, that would also be shelved. What's sad about this one though is that it could have been avoided had the heels won that SummerSlam match and carried on their momentum into the autumn. But not all botched booking decisions have such a negative ripple effect. No, some can be far smaller in scale and just represent a missed opportunity, with this being exactly what happened when the Iconics were split in 2020. Yes, this one didn't work out too well in the long run for either Peyton Royce or Billy Kay, as after they separated, neither one ever managed to go on to have any major success in WWE. But then the Iconics' strength was always in their partnership, with their comedy antics working because they had each other to play off. So when you took that away and tried to go with Royce as a singles performer, or tried to recapture the magic with Kay by teaming her up with the likes of the Riot Squad, it was just never the same. Needless to say then, it wouldn't be long after the breakup before both Peyton and Billy found themselves out of WWE. And what a shame that was, because not only did it take them off the board in WWE, but it also dealt a blow to the women's tag team division. And this was because they were one of the very few established women's tag teams WWE had. So when you took them away, pretty much all you were left with were thrown together makeshift pairings who rarely had any chemistry. Fortunately for Royce and Kay though, as soon as they left WWE and headed over to Impact, they'd be paired up again, with them going on to win the tag titles there. But with the pair now seemingly only wrestling on a part-time schedule, with Peyton most recently wrestling in Australia and Billy's last match to date coming in TNA in 2022, it doesn't look like we're going to be seeing them teaming up again anytime soon, whether that be in WWE or anywhere else. But even if that is the case, at least the Iconics had some good times before the bad times hit them.